In the frozen mountains of North Korea, one hill stood between survival and disaster. If that hill fell, thousands of Marines and soldiers, fighting their way out of the Chosin Reservoir, might never reach the sea. The road south could be cut, the wounded could be trapped, the column could be broken apart in the snow. And on that hill, surrounded in sub-zero darkness, stood Captain William E. Barber and the Marines of Fox Company. Barber was already wounded. His company was isolated. The enemy was attacking from all sides. Temperatures dropped far below anything most of his men had ever known. Weapons froze. Skin froze. Blood froze. Sleep became dangerous. Movement became painful. Every hour made survival less certain. But Barber understood something the men around him also understood. They were not holding that hill for themselves alone. They were holding it for the thousands of men behind them. If Fox Company broke, the road through Toktong Pass could close. If the pass closed, the breakout from Chosin might become something far worse than a retreat. It might become a disaster. So Barber stayed. This is not the story of the entire Battle of Chosin Reservoir. It is not a story about generals, maps, or sweeping movements across Korea. It is the story of one Marine captain, one frozen hill, and the men who held long enough for others to escape. William Earl Barber was not new to war when he reached Korea. He had already served in World War II. He had already seen what combat could do to men. By 1950, he was a Marine officer with experience, discipline, and the kind of quiet authority that mattered most when conditions became impossible. He did not need to speak loudly to be followed. He needed to be steady. That steadiness would matter at Chosin. The Korean War had begun only months earlier, but by late 1950, it had already changed shape several times. North Korean forces had invaded the South. United Nations forces, led largely by the United States, had nearly been pushed into the sea at Pusan. Then came the Incheon landing, the breakout, and the rapid advance north. For a moment, it seemed possible that the war might end quickly. Then Chinese forces entered the war in massive numbers. In the mountains around the Chosin Reservoir, winter became another enemy. The cold was not background. It was not atmosphere. It was a force that entered weapons, vehicles, clothing, food, and flesh. Men slept with rifles inside their sleeping bags when they could. Canteens froze. Medical supplies froze. Batteries failed. Oil thickened. Frostbite took men who had never been touched by a bullet. The Marines would later call themselves the Chosin Few. The name carried pride, but it also carried memory. It meant men who had lived through a place that seemed designed to kill them slowly before the enemy even arrived. Into that frozen landscape moved Fox Company. Their assignment was simple in wording and nearly impossible in execution. Hold Toktong Pass. A pass can sound like a geographic detail. On a map, it may appear as a narrow point along a road. But in war, a pass can become a lifeline. It can determine whether units move or stop, whether wounded men can be evacuated, whether supplies can reach the front, and whether a retreat remains organized or collapses into chaos. Toktong Pass sat along the road between Udamni and Hagaruri. For the Marines fighting around Chosin, that road mattered. It was not just a route. It was a thread connecting men, vehicles, ammunition, medical aid, and hope. Fox Company was ordered to hold the high ground overlooking that pass. Captain Barber understood the importance of the assignment. He also understood what it meant for his men. They would be isolated. They would be exposed. They would be expected to hold ground that larger forces might try to overrun. And if the enemy understood the importance of that position, Fox Company would become a target. The Marines climbed into the hills and prepared as best they could. There were no perfect defenses. The ground was frozen. Digging in was difficult. Cold made every task slower and more exhausting. The men improved positions where they could, placed weapons, organized fields of fire, and waited. Waiting in combat is its own form of punishment. Men listen for movement in the dark. They imagine shapes that may or may not be there. They think about the cold. They think about home. They wonder whether dawn will come before the attack does. For Fox Company, the attack came. Chinese forces moved through the darkness with determination. They understood the value of the pass. They understood that if they could break Fox Company, they could threaten the road and the Marines trying to move south. The first assaults were violent, sudden, and relentless. Noise filled the hill. Bugles, gunfire, explosions, shouted orders, and the terrible confusion of night combat washed over the frozen positions. The Marines fought back. They were outnumbered, isolated, and freezing, but they were Marines and they had a mission. Barber moved among his men as best he could. Leadership in a fight like that is not abstract. It is visible. It is the officer who checks positions, the voice that steadies men when the line begins to bend. The decision to shift fire, reinforce a weak point, or hold reserves for a moment that may come minutes later. In darkness, men often fight not because they understand the whole battle, but because someone they trust tells them the line must hold. Barber became that center. Then he was wounded. For many officers, that would have ended active command. In those conditions, evacuation was not weakness. It was common sense. A wounded commander could become a burden. Pain could cloud judgment. The cold could turn a wound into something worse. Every practical argument pointed toward getting Barber off the hill if possible. Barber refused to leave. That decision defined the defense. He understood that his presence mattered. He understood that if the men saw their commander stay while wounded, they would know the position still mattered enough to die for. This was not theater. It was not pride. It was responsibility. Fox Company was not holding a hill for glory. They were holding it because thousands of men needed the road open. The assaults continued. Night after night, the enemy came against the frozen hill. The Marines fired until weapons malfunctioned, until ammunition ran low, until hands stiffened and bodies shook from exhaustion. Some men were hit. Some froze. Some kept fighting because there was no safe place to stop. The cold turned everything into labor. Loading a weapon required fingers that still worked. Moving from one position to another required strength that the body no longer wanted to give. Caring for the wounded meant trying to keep men alive in temperatures that punished stillness. Even courage had to fight through numbness. Barber's wound did not disappear. It stayed with him hour after hour, but he stayed with his men. There is a difference between being trapped and choosing to hold. Fox Company was isolated, but Barber's leadership kept the isolation from becoming panic. The hill remained dangerous. The situation remained desperate, but the company still had purpose. Hold the pass, hold the road, hold long enough. That phrase became the entire meaning of the fight. Hold long enough. Long enough for help to come. Long enough for the larger movement to continue. Long enough for the men withdrawing from Chosin to pass through. Long enough for the wounded to have a chance. Few people outside the military fully understand the burden of holding ground. It can seem passive compared to an attack, but holding can demand more than advancing. When a unit attacks, it moves toward a goal. When it holds, it must absorb punishment. It must remain in place while fear, cold, exhaustion, and enemy pressure all argue for withdrawal. Fox Company held. As the days passed, the hill became a world of its own. The rest of Korea might as well have been another planet. The war narrowed to snow, rock, weapons, wounded men, and the next attack. Men measured time not by clocks, but by assaults, ammunition, and whether they had survived until morning. Around them, the broader Chosin breakout continued to unfold. American and United Nations forces were fighting their way south under conditions that tested every level of command and endurance. Vehicles crawled along frozen roads. Wounded men were loaded onto trucks. Engineers worked to keep routes open. Marines fought through roadblocks and ambushes. Aircraft supported where weather allowed. Every mile mattered. And above one of the most important stretches of that road, Barber's Marines remained. If the enemy took the pass, the consequences could spread far beyond Fox Company. That was the terrible arithmetic of their position. A few hundred men on a hill were helping protect the movement of thousands. That is why sacrifice can be difficult to measure. Fox Company's suffering was immediate and visible to those who endured it. The men they helped protect may not have known their names. Some may have passed through the road below without understanding exactly how close the danger had been. But the fact that a man does not know who saved him does not make the saving any less real. History often remembers rescue as a dramatic moment. A rope thrown to a burning ship, a helicopter landing under fire, a medic pulling a wounded man from a field. But sometimes rescue looks like men staying in place. Sometimes rescue is a line that does not break. That was Fox Company at Toktong Pass. Barber continued to lead through the siege. He organized the defense, encouraged his Marines, and refused evacuation. The company absorbed repeated attacks and mounting casualties, but the position remained in American hands. The hill did not fall. Relief efforts were not simple. Reaching Fox Company meant fighting through the same terrain and enemy pressure that had isolated them. The men on the hill could not assume help would arrive quickly. They could only keep holding. The psychological weight of that is hard to overstate. A surrounded unit lives inside uncertainty. Every sound in the dark may signal another attack. Every delay can feel like abandonment, even when commanders elsewhere are doing everything possible. Every casualty reduces strength. Every hour of cold steals more from the living. Yet Barber's refusal to leave gave the defense a human anchor. He was wounded, but he stayed. He was surrounded, but he commanded. He was responsible for men who were suffering, and he chose to suffer with them. That kind of leadership cannot be manufactured. It does not come from rank alone. It comes from the belief, shared by those watching, that the man giving orders has accepted the same danger he asks of others. The Marines of Fox Company paid heavily. Many were killed or wounded. Many endured frostbite and exhaustion. Some lived with the memory of that hill for the rest of their lives. The word survival can sound clean from a distance. Up close, survival often leaves marks that do not fade. Still, they held. When relief finally reached Fox Company and the breakout continued, the importance of their stand became clearer. The pass had remained open. The road had not been severed. The larger force had been given time and space to continue moving south. The Chosin breakout would become one of the defining episodes in Marine Corps history. It was not a retreat in the ordinary sense. Marines later spoke of attacking in another direction. The phrase carried defiance, but behind it was brutal reality. They were surrounded in hostile terrain, in deadly cold, against a determined enemy, with wounded men and limited options. Getting out required discipline, sacrifice, and countless small acts of courage. Captain William Barber and Fox Company became part of that larger survival. But this story should not be reduced to a slogan. The men on that hill were not symbols while they were freezing in the dark. They were human beings, young men, tired men, frightened men, men who wanted to live, men who held because others needed them to hold. That is where the meaning of the story lives. Barber would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions at Chosin. The medal recognized extraordinary leadership and courage, but no medal can fully contain what those days demanded. Citations summarize. Ceremonies honor history records, but the lived experience belonged to the men who were there. For Barber, the honor did not change the cost. It did not restore the dead. It did not erase the cold. It did not remove the burden of memory. What it did do was preserve a truth. At a frozen mountain pass in Korea, one Marine captain and his company held when breaking would have been understandable. They endured when leaving might have seemed reasonable. They stayed because the road below them mattered more than their own safety. That truth deserves remembrance. The Korean War has often been called the Forgotten War. It sits between World War II and Vietnam in American memory, overshadowed by both. Many Americans know the names Normandy, Iwo Jima, Pearl Harbor, and Quezon. Fewer can explain Chosin Reservoir. Fewer still know Toktong Pass or Fox Hill. But forgetting a war does not lessen the sacrifices made there. The men at Chosin were not fighting in a lesser conflict simply because later generations remembered it less clearly. Their cold was real. Their wounds were real. Their losses were real. Their courage was real. And for the men trying to escape through the mountains, the defense of one frozen hill was not a footnote. It was a lifeline. There is a lesson in that. History often celebrates the people who move forward, the charge, the breakout, the final push. But sometimes, the people who matter most are the ones who stay, the ones who hold the door open, the ones who keep a road alive, the ones who accept that their own position may become a shield for others. Captain Barber's story is about that kind of sacrifice. Not sacrifice as an idea, sacrifice as a physical reality. Cold, pain, isolation, fear, wounds. Men looking to their commander and seeing that he had not left them. That is why this story belongs to history reframed. Because behind every great turning point were ordinary people placed under extraordinary pressure. Barber became a decorated hero, but on that hill he was first a Marine officer trying to keep his men together and keep a road open. Fox Company became legendary, but in the moment they were simply cold, exhausted Marines doing what had to be done. They held a frozen hill so thousands of others could escape. That sentence is simple. The reality behind it was not. Imagine standing there as the temperature falls and the darkness thickens. Imagine knowing that withdrawal could doom men you may never meet. Imagine hearing movement below the ridge and wondering whether the next attack will be the one that breaks the line. Imagine being wounded and still choosing to remain because leaving would tell your men something you cannot afford to say. Barber stayed. Fox Company stayed. The hill held. Years later, the snow melted. The battlefield changed. Men returned home. Some told their stories. Some did not. The Korean War settled into a difficult place in American memory, honored by some, overlooked by many. But the meaning of Toktong Pass remained. There are moments when history depends on people who do not get to see the full result of what they have done. The men on Fox Hill did not watch 11,000 men escape in a single sweeping scene. They did not stand apart from the battle and see the entire map. They saw only the next ridge, the next attack, the next wounded Marine, the next hour of cold. But their endurance helped make survival possible for others. That is enough. Not every act of courage needs to change the world to matter. Some acts preserve a road, some protect a column, some buy time, some give wounded men a chance to keep moving. Some prevent a disaster that later generations may never fully understand because it did not happen. That is the hidden nature of sacrifice. When it succeeds, the catastrophe it prevented may disappear from memory. People remember the escape, but not always the hill that made it possible. History deserves better than that. It deserves to remember Captain William E. Barber. It deserves to remember Fox Company. It deserves to remember the frozen pass where Marines held against the odds because thousands of others needed them to. Not to glorify war. War in Korea was brutal, cold, confusing, and costly. It left families grieving and veterans carrying memories too heavy for ordinary language. But remembering sacrifice is not the same as glorifying war. It is acknowledging that, inside terrible circumstances, human beings can still choose duty. They can still choose courage. They can still choose to remain when leaving would be easier. At Chosin, Captain Barber and Fox Company made that choice. The road stayed open. The breakout continued. And thousands of men had a chance to make it home. History deserves to be remembered. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing to History Reframed. Every story we preserve helps keep alive the memory of ordinary people who stepped forward when history asked something difficult of them. Until next time, remember this. History is rarely shaped only by famous names or grand decisions. More often, it is shaped by people who hold the line when others need a way through. And sometimes, one frozen hill is enough to save thousands of lives.